The year is 1699. In colonial Havana, under the scorching Caribbean sun, a young woman of barely 17 walks nervously through the marble corridors of Cuba's most powerful hacienda. Isabela Mendoza carries within her womb the most dangerous secret on the entire island. She is pregnant with the wrong man, not a Spanish nobleman, not a wealthy merchant, but Tomas, an African slave from her own father's plantation. If you want to discover how this forbidden love unleashed one of the most brutal massacres in colonial Cuba, subscribe now and press the bell, because this story will shock you from the first minute. The Hacienda San Rafael stretches like a green empire under the blue Havana sky. Don Eduardo Mendoza, a 52-year-old man with a gray beard and stern eyes, has built his fortune on the suffering of more than 200 African slaves who work his sugar fields from dawn to dusk. His daughter Isabela is the jewel of Havana society. Brown hair styled in elaborate hairstyles, silk dresses imported from Spain, and a refined education make match in all of Cuba. But behind that perfect facade, Isabela hides a reality that could destroy not only her life, but the lives of dozens of others. It all began 6 months ago when Tomas, a 24-year-old slave from Angola, was assigned as the gardener of the main house. He was tall, with muscles defined by years of forced labor, and an intelligence that shone in his dark eyes despite the chains on his ankles. The first time their eyes met was during siesta time. Isabela was reading in the garden when she noticed someone watching her from the rose bushes. Tomas pruned the flowers with precise movements, but his eyes constantly strayed toward the young woman. That exchange of glances lasted only seconds, but it was enough to ignite a spark that would change everyone's destiny. The following weeks were a dangerous game of chance encounters. Isabela began spending more time in the garden, always with a book in her hands as an excuse. Tomas, for his part, managed to be nearby when she appeared, pretending to concentrate on his work while listening to the rustle of the pages she turned. The first real contact occurred when Isabela stumbled near the garden's central fountain. Tomas, without thinking, ran to help her, holding her arm to prevent her from falling. The contact lasted only an instant, but they both felt an electricity that left them breathless. "Thank you," Isabela murmured, her cheeks flushed. "You're welcome, miss," Tomas replied, immediately lowering his gaze, aware of the mortal danger that moment represented. But it was already too late. Love was born in the most impossible place, between two worlds that should never touch. The following days became a dangerous dance of stolen glances and unspoken words. Isabela discovered that Tomas could read extraordinarily well for a slave at that time. During his youth in Angola, he had learned from a Portuguese missionary before being captured and sold into slavery. Communication began through small notes Isabela left hidden among the books she carried to the garden. Tomas would find them during his work and respond in shaky but clear handwriting, leaving his answers under a loose stone near the fountain. "I don't understand what's happening to me," Isabela wrote in her first letter. "Me neither, miss, but I know it's dangerous for both of us," Tomas replied. "Do you believe in destiny?" "I believe some things are beyond our control, but I also believe some decisions can cost us our lives." The letters became more intimate as the weeks passed. Isabela shared her dreams, her frustrations. With a life full of luxuries but devoid of freedom, Tomas told her about Africa, about his lost family, about the dreams he'd had to abandon when the chains closed around his wrist. Their first physical encounter occurred during a moonlit night. Isabela had waited until the entire house was asleep before slipping out into the garden. Tomas waited for her by the orange trees, silhouette barely visible in the darkness. "This is crazy," Isabela whispered, but she didn't move away when he reached out his hand. "I know," Tomas replied, "but I can't pretend I don't feel anything anymore." They kissed under the stars, a kiss that tasted of rebellion and tragedy foretold. It was Isabela's first kiss, and perhaps their last if anyone found out. Their nightly encounters became regular. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. They shared impossible dreams of a world where skin color didn't determine a person's destiny. Tomas taught her words in his native language, and Isabela told him about the books she read, about the love stories she so admired, unaware she was living her own. Physical intimacy came gradually. At first, it was just stolen kisses, then trembling caresses under the moonlight. Isabella, raised in the strictest Catholic morality, struggled between her principles and a desire that consumed her from within. One April night, as the orange blossoms perfumed the air, they gave themselves completely to each other. It was an act of love and rebellion, of hope and despair. They knew what they were doing could cost them their lives, but in that moment, surrounded by the fragrance of the flowers and the whisper of the wind, the outside world ceased to exist. But the outside world hadn't disappeared. It was there, waiting with its cruel laws and relentless punishments. 2 months later, Isabella noticed the first symptoms: the absence of her period, morning sickness, changes in her body that she couldn't ignore. She was pregnant. The situation was becoming desperate. You like this video if you want to know how Isabella will try to hide her pregnancy in a society that would condemn her to death for this sin. The mirror didn't lie. Isabella watched her reflection every morning for signs of the change growing within her. Her waist, once so narrow it required tight corsets, was beginning to subtly round out. Her breasts had become more tender, and morning sickness forced her to make up excuses to avoid the family breakfast. "Father, I think I've come down with some stomach upset," Isabella would lie during one such morning, feigning weakness while Don Eduardo watched her with paternal concern. "Perhaps we should call the doctor," her father would suggest, and Isabella's heart would stop for a moment. A medical examination would immediately reveal her condition. "No need, I just need a rest," he would quickly respond, retreating to his room with his heart pounding. The nights became his refuge and his torment. In the darkness of her room, Isabella caressed her slightly swollen belly, feeling a mixture of terror and tenderness that tore at her insides. A new life was growing inside her, the product of the purest and most forbidden love she had ever known. Her encounters with Tomas became more urgent and desperate. During one of those nocturnal encounters, she finally told him the truth. "I'm pregnant." The words came out of her lips as a strangled whisper. Tomas remained motionless for a moment that seemed eternal. Then, he slowly knelt in front of her and placed his hands on Isabella's belly. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Completely sure." Tomas's eyes filled with tears. He was a father, but he was also aware that this news could mean death for both of them, and for the unborn child. "What are we going to do?" Isabella asked, her own tears falling silently. "I don't know," Tomas admitted, "but I won't let you face this alone." They began to plan desperately. Tomas had heard stories of slaves who had escaped north to territories where slavery did not exist. But those stories also spoke of relentless pursuits, of dogs trained to track fugitives, of punishments they preferred not to imagine. Isabella considered other options. She knew a healer in the village, an older woman who was said to know herbs for feminine problems. But the idea of getting rid of the baby was impossible. She already loved the little life inside her. Over the next few weeks, Isabella became adept at the art of deception. She wore looser dresses, complained of backaches to justify her more careful posture, and avoided any situation that might expose her to suspicion. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves. Maria, the house slave in charge of Isabella's laundry, began to notice irregularities. The young woman's menstrual cloths were nowhere to be found to be washed month after month. Maria, a mother of 3, immediately recognized the signs. One morning, while Isabella was pretending to be ill in her room, Maria approached her bedside with a cup of tea. "Miss Isabella," she said in a soft but serious voice, "I know what's happening to you." Isabella's world stopped. "I don't know what you're talking about, Maria. Miss, I've been pregnant." "I know how to recognize the signs." Mary's eyes filled with compassion and terror. "Who is the father?" Isabella couldn't answer. Tears began to fall down her cheeks as Maria sat on the edge of the bed. "Oh, child," Maria murmured, "what trouble have you gotten yourself into?" Maria became Isabella's unwilling confidant. For the next few days, the house slave struggled with the weight of the secret she now shared. As a mother, she understood the love Isabella felt for her unborn child. As a slave, she understood the terrible consequences that awaited everyone involved if the truth came out. "You must tell me who the father is," Maria insisted during one of their whispered conversations. "Perhaps we can find a solution." Isabella evaded the question again and again, but finally, pressed by desperation and the need for support, she confessed the truth. "It's Tomas," the gardener whispered. Maria's face paled as if she had seen a ghost. "My godchild, do you know what you've done?" "I know it's forbidden, but it's not just forbidden," Maria interrupted urgently. "It's a death sentence for him, for you, and for the baby. Don Eduardo is known for his cruelty to slaves who dare to even look at a white woman." Maria was right. Don Eduardo Mendoza was famous throughout Havana for the exemplary punishments he inflicted on his slaves. 3 years earlier, he had ordered a slave accused of stealing food to be whipped to death. Stories of his cruelty spread throughout the island's plantations. "There has to be a way," Isabella pleaded. "We could say the father is a young Spaniard, someone who left the island when the baby is born," Maria asked harshly. "Mixed children are recognizable from day one. You can't hide the African blood." Isabella hadn't thought of that. In his desperation, he had imagined that he could somehow keep the secret forever. But Maria was right. A mixed-race baby would be immediate evidence of his sin. Meanwhile, Thomas lived his own agony. During the day he worked in the gardens, but his mind was constantly on Isabella and the baby growing in her womb. He had begun saving every coin he got, thinking about a possible escape, but he knew the chances of success were minimal. The other slaves noticed his strange behavior. Joaquin, an older man who had been like a father to Tomas since his arrival at the plantation, approached him one afternoon while they were working in the cane fields. "Boy, what's happening to you?" Joaquin asked with concern. "You walk around like you have the __ following you." Tomas was about to confess everything to Joaquin. The older man was wise and respected among the slaves, but he also knew how to keep secrets. However, something held him back. Perhaps the instinct to protect Isabella and the baby, or perhaps the realization that involving more people would only increase the danger. "I'm just tired," Tomas lied, but Joaquin wasn't fooled. "Careful, son," the older man warned him. "On this plantation, secrets have a way of getting out, and when they do, the consequences are terrible. The secret is about to explode. Do you think Isabella and Tomas will manage to escape before Don Eduardo discovers the truth? Comment your prediction and share this video with someone who loves impossible love stories." The pressure became unbearable when Don Eduardo announced during dinner that he had agreed to Isabella's engagement to Rodrigo Vasquez, the son of another powerful landowner on the island. "The wedding will take place in 3 months," Don Eduardo declared with satisfaction. "It is a perfect match for our families." Isabella felt like the world was collapsing around her. In 3 months, her pregnancy would be obvious to everyone. There would be no way to hide it during the ceremony, much less on their wedding night. That night, after making sure the entire house was asleep, Isabella ran to the garden where Tomas was waiting for her, as he did every night. "My father arranged my marriage," she told him between sobs. "The wedding is in 3 months." Tomas hugged her tightly, feeling as if his heart had been ripped from his chest. "You can't marry him," he murmured against her hair. "I have no choice." "Yes, you do," Tomas said, pulling away to look into her eyes. "We can escape tonight." The idea of escape had been brewing in Tomas's mind for weeks, but now it had become a desperate necessity. That night, under the light of a waning moon, he shared with Isabella all the details he had been secretly planning. "I know a man at the port," Tomas explained urgently. "His name is Captain Morales. He's a smuggler, but he also helps runaway slaves in exchange for money. He can take us to Jamaica, where Spanish law can't reach us." Isabella listened, her heart pounding. The idea of leaving everything she knew behind terrified her, but the alternative was even worse. "How much money do we need?" she asked. 100 silver pesos, Tomas replied. "It's a lot of money, but I have jewelry," Isabella interrupted. "The necklaces, bracelets, and earrings my father has given me over the years must be worth much more than that." Tomas felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. "Would you be willing to do that, to leave everything?" Isabella placed Tomas's hands on her belly. "For you and our son, I would leave the entire world." They began to plan meticulously. The escape would have to occur during the night of the following Sunday, when Don Eduardo would be in Havana attending a merchants' meeting that would last until dawn. Isabella would begin to gather her jewels, little by little, storing them in a small sack that she would hide under her bed. Tomas, for his part, began establishing contact with Captain Morales through Joaquin, who knew someone who worked on the docks. The message was simple. Two fugitives needed urgent passage to Jamaica and had the money to pay. But the preparations did not go unnoticed by Maria. The domestic slave noticed that Isabella had begun to behave even stranger. The young woman would spend long periods in front of her jewelry box, examining each piece with an intensity that was unusual. One afternoon, Maria decided to confront her directly. "Miss Isabella, what are you planning?" Isabella tried to feign normalcy, but Maria knew her too well. "Nothing. Maria was just admiring my jewelry." "Little girl, I wasn't born yesterday," Maria said firmly. "You're planning something dangerous. I can see it in your eyes." Finally, Isabella relented and told her about the escape plan. Maria listened silently, her expression growing more serious with each detail. "This is crazy," she muttered when Isabella finished speaking. "The roads are full of slave hunters, and even if they reach the port, how do they know they can trust that captain?" "It's our only chance," Isabella insisted. Maria sighed deeply. As a mother, she understood Isabella's desperation. As a slave, she knew better than anyone the dangers of the outside world. "If you're going to do this," she finally said, "you'll need help." Maria became an unexpected helper. He knew the schedules of all the guards on the plantation. He knew which roads were less well guarded and had contacts among the house slaves who could provide valuable information. Sunday night, Maria confirmed, "The guards at the North Gate will be drunk after the cockfight. It's your only chance." Meanwhile, Tomas had received a response from Captain Morale. The man would be willing to help them, but there were strict conditions. They had to be at the dock at exactly 2 o'clock a.m. Bring the cash and ask no questions about the ship's destination or the nature of its cargo. On Friday night, Isabella managed to gather all her most valuable jewels. She carefully wrapped them in silk and hid them in a small trunk that she would keep under her bed until the moment of escape. Saturday passed with agonizing slowness. Isabella could barely eat, and her nerves were so frayed that Maria had to make up constant excuses to justify her behavior to the other maids in the house. Tomas, meanwhile, worked in the garden with a feigned calm that fooled everyone except Joachim. The older man approached him at the end of the day. "Whatever you're planning, son," she said softly, "may God be with you." Tomas looked at him in surprise, but Joachim simply nodded and walked away without another word. Sunday night finally arrived. Don Eduardo left for Havana after dinner, as Isabella had hoped. The house gradually fell silent as the servants retired to their rooms. At 11 o'clock p.m., Isabella dressed in dark, practical clothing, very different from the elegant dresses she normally wore. She took the trunk with the jewelry and quietly made her way to her bedroom door. The night of the escape had finally arrived. Isabella, dressed in a dark skirt and a simple blouse she had borrowed from Maria's closet, slipped silently through the marble hallways of the house. Every creak of the floor beneath her feet sounded like a gunshot in the still night. Her heart was beating so loudly that she was afraid someone could hear it. She held the small trunk of jewelry tightly against her chest, aware that it contained not only her future, but also the life of Tomas and her unborn child. In the garden, Tomas was waiting for her by the orange trees, his silhouette barely visible in the darkness. He had managed to obtain civilian clothes from one of the traders who frequented the plantation, secretly exchanging them for extra work. He no longer looked like a slave, but like any other young worker. "Ready," he whispered to her when Isabella approached. "As ready as one can be to leave a whole life behind," she replied, trying to sound braver than she felt. Tomas took the trunk and offered his arm. Together, they began walking toward the northern part of the property, where Maria had confirmed the guards would be distracted. The plan worked perfectly for the first 20 minutes. They managed to avoid the main guards and made it to the edge of the plantation undetected. The road to Havana stretched out before them like a promise of freedom. But their luck ran out when they encountered an unexpected patrol. "Stop right there," a voice called from the darkness. Two Spanish soldiers emerged from the trees, their uniforms gleaming faintly in the starlight. They carried muskets and swords, and their faces displayed the immediate suspicion aroused by anyone walking the roads in the middle of the night. "Who are you, and what are you doing at this hour?" demanded the sergeant, a burly man with a thick mustache. Isabella felt her mouth go dry. They had rehearsed this situation, but now that it was real, their minds went blank. "We are husband and wife," Tomas stammered, trying to sound convincing. "We're coming from visiting my wife's family on the Mendoza plantation." "We're late, and husband and wife?" the sergeant interrupted, shining his flashlight on both of their faces. "Let's see your marriage papers." Isabella's blood ran cold. They hadn't thought of forged papers. It was a fatal mistake. "We left them at home," Isabella murmured, but her trembling voice immediately gave her away. The sergeant leaned closer, carefully examining both of their faces in the light of his flashlight. When the light illuminated Tomas's features, his expression immediately changed. "Wait a moment," he said slowly. "You have African characteristics. You are a free man." Tomas swallowed with difficulty. "Yes, sir, I am a freedman." "So, you have manumission papers, right?" The silence that followed was his answer. The sergeant smiled cruelly. "We have a runaway slave," he told his partner and accomplice. "No," Isabella cried. "All pretense is abandoned. He's not a fugitive." "I am Isabella Mendoza, daughter of Don Eduardo Mendoza." The sergeant looked at her with incredulity, then with a slow, terrible realization. Don Eduardo's daughter fleeing in the night with a slave. His laugh was cold and pitiless. "This is getting interesting." The other soldier tied Tomas's hands while the sergeant held Isabella. Despite her protests and pleas, they were dragged back toward the plantation. "Please," Isabella begged as they walked, "you have to understand, we are in love. We were going to get married." "The only thing I understand," the sergeant replied, "is that Don Eduardo Mendoza is going to want to speak with you personally." When they arrived at the main house, it was already 3:00 a.m. The windows were dark, but the soldiers banged on the door until a sleepy servant appeared. "Wake Don Eduardo," the sergeant ordered. "We have something you need to see immediately." 20 minutes later, Don Eduardo Mendoza appeared in the main hall, dressed in a silk robe and with red eyes from being rudely awakened. His annoyed expression transformed into socks when he saw his daughter with her hands tied, accompanied by Tomas. "What does this mean?" he roared, his voice filling the room. "We found your daughter running away with this slave." "Sir," the sergeant explained, "apparently they were planning to escape together." Don Eduardo looked at Isabella as if he didn't recognize her. "Isabella, what are you doing?" Isabella raised her chin with desperate dignity. "Father, there is something you need to know." The main hall of Hacienda San Rafael had become a makeshift courtroom. Don Eduardo Mendoza, his eyes bloodshot and his face flushed with anger, paced back and forth like a caged lion. Isabella stood in the center of the hall with her hands still tied while Tomas knelt on the floor, flanked by the two soldiers. "Explain yourself," Don Eduardo roared, his voice reverberating off the marble walls. "Explain to me why my daughter, the jewel of my family, was running away in the middle of the night with a slave." Isabella took a deep breath. She knew the moment of truth had arrived, and that her next words would determine not only her fate, but also Tomas's and her baby. "Father," he began in a trembling but firm voice, "I am pregnant." The silence that followed was deafening. Don Eduardo stopped dead in his tracks, as if he had received a physical blow. His face paled at first, then reddened even further. Embarrassed, he repeated slowly as if unable to comprehend the words. Yes, father. And Tomas is the father of my son. The explosion of anger that followed was like a hurricane. Don Eduardo grabbed a carved wooden chair and threw it against the wall where it shattered into pieces. The soldiers instinctively retreated. "Damn you!" he shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "Damn you, Isabella! How could you dishonor our family like this?" "It's not dishonor," Isabella retorted with courage born of desperation. "It's love. I love Tomas and he loves me." Don Eduardo approached his daughter with threatening steps. "Love, that beast has corrupted you, turned you into a woman who chooses for herself," Isabella finished, raising her chin defiantly. The slap echoed like a gunshot in the living room. Isabella staggered, her cheek immediately reddening, but she didn't fall. "Father, please," she begged, tears in her eyes. "If you have ever loved me, to love her." Don Eduardo now turned to Tomas, who had remained silent, watching the scene with a mixture of pain and determination. "You filthy slave! How dare you touch my daughter?" Tomas looked up, and for the first time in his life as a slave, spoke without asking permission. "I love her, sir," he said, his voice clear and firm. "I love her more than my own life." "Shut up, Don Eduardo." He kicked him in the stomach, making him double over in pain. "You have no right to speak in my presence." But Tomas managed to keep talking. "Sir, if you must punish someone, punish me. Isabella did nothing wrong. She only followed her heart." "Her heart," Don Eduardo laughed bitterly. "Her heart has led her to ruin. And you, beast, have contaminated the pure blood of my family." "We are not beasts," Isabella cried, finding strength in defending Tomas. "He is nobler than any man I know. Kinder, more intelligent, more compassionate." Don Eduardo turned to the soldiers. "Take this animal to the stables. I want him whipped until his back is raw. Then we will brand him with a hot iron so everyone knows he is a slave who dared to touch a white woman." "No!" Isabella threw herself at her father, trying to grab his arm. "Please, father, if you have to punish someone, punish me." "Oh, don't worry, my dear child," said Don Eduardo with a cruel smile. "Your punishment will be different, but just as effective." He turned to Maria, who had appeared in the parlor doorway, awakened by the screams. "Maria, call Dr. Herrera immediately. Tell him it's an emergency." Maria paled, immediately understanding the implications. "Sir, please do it," Don Eduardo roared. Dr. Herrera was known throughout Havana not only for his medical skills, but also for his discretion in delicate matters. There were several prominent families to resolve similar issues. "Father, no," Isabella murmured, finally understanding what her father had planned. "You can't do that." "I can and I will," Don Eduardo replied coldly. "That bastard will be ripped from your womb, and then you will marry Rodrigo Vasquez as planned. This dishonor will be completely erased. He is your grandson," Isabella cried in despair. "He is not my grandson," Don Eduardo roared. "He is the spawn of the devil and will be destroyed before he sees the light of day." The soldiers began dragging Tomas toward the door. He struggled to free himself, calling out Isabella's name as she screamed her own, but the ropes were too strong and the soldiers too numerous. "Isabella!" Tomas cried as he was dragged. "Don't let them hurt you. Fight back." "I love you," she cried back. "I will always love you." Words of love turned to screams of pain as the soldiers beat Tomas to silence him. The tragedy is reaching its darkest point. Do you think Isabella and Tomas will survive this nightmare? Click like if you want to see this story reach its heartbreaking end. Tomas' screams, being whipped in the stables, could be heard all the way to the main house. Don Eduardo had ordered the windows to remain open, so Isabella could hear every lash, every cry of pain from the man she loved. So you can learn, her father had cruelly told her, the price of dishonor. Isabella was locked in her room, but Maria had managed to sneak in to be with her. Both women hugged each other as they listened to the sounds of torture, tears running freely down their faces. "Miss," Maria whispered, "I have to tell you something. The other slaves are very upset. Joaquin is trying to calm them down." "What do you mean?" Isabella asked between sobs. "They all love Tomas. He's like a little brother to many of them, and what Don Eduardo is doing." Maria didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. In the slave quarters, a silent but deadly fury was indeed growing. Joaquin, Jose the blacksmith, Miguel the stable foreman, and 15 other slaves had gathered secretly as Tomas's screams filled the night. "This can't continue," Jose muttered, his fists clenched until the knuckles turned white. "That boy never hurt anyone, and Miss Isabella," Miguel added, "has always been good to us. She never treated us like animals." Joaquin, the wisest of the group, tried to be the voice of reason. "Brothers, I understand your anger. I feel it too. But if we do something stupid tonight, we'll all die. We're already dying." Jose retorted, "Little by little, every day. At least this way we'll die like men." Tomas's screams suddenly ceased. An ominous silence fell over the plantation. The slaves exchanged knowing glances. They knew what that silence meant. 5 minutes later, one of the soldiers entered the barracks. "The slave Tomas is dead," he announced, without emotion. "His body will be hung in the square tomorrow, as an example to all." The silence that followed was more terrible than any scream. Joaquin closed his eyes, knowing there was no way to stop what was about to happen. "Brothers," he finally said, his voice filled with an ancestral sadness, "tonight we die as free men." In the main house, Isabella had heard the terrible silence. When Mary confirmed what he already knew in his heart, something broke inside him forever. "He's dead," he murmured, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Tomas is dead." Maria hugged her as Isabella began to laugh and cry at the same time, her mind fracturing under the weight of grief. "Miss, you have to be strong," Maria pleaded, "because of the baby." "What baby?" Isabella asked with a terrible smile. "Father will make sure there's no baby, and then he'll marry me off to Rodrigo, and we'll all pretend this never happened." At 1:00 a.m., Dr. Herrera finally arrived at the hacienda. He was a thin, nervous man, his hands trembling slightly as Don Eduardo explained what he needed. "Don Eduardo," the doctor murmured, "what you're asking is complicated. The young lady is quite advanced in her pregnancy." "I don't care how complicated it is," Don Eduardo retorted. "Do it." But before the doctor could go up to Isabella's room, the screams began. This time they weren't coming from the stables. They were coming from the main house. Jose had entered through the kitchen, his hands wrapped in chains he had broken in the blacksmith's shop. Miguel and 4 other slaves followed him, armed with cane-cutting machetes, hammers, and whatever tools they could find. The first soldier they crossed died before he could even scream. Joseph slammed a hammer into his head with a strength born of years of suppressed hatred. "For Tomas!" he screamed, and his words became the battle cry of the rebellion. Don Eduardo heard the shouts from the parlor and immediately understood what was happening. "Immenseda for Etanato." "Soldiers!" he shouted, but only one answered his call. Jose and Miguel burst into the parlor like a storm of revenge. Don Eduardo tried to grab his pistol, but Jose was quicker. The hammer slammed into the landowner's skull with a sharp, terrible sound. Dr. Herrera tried to flee, but Miguel caught up with him on the stairs. For the next 2 hours, the San Rafael hacienda became a living hell. The rebellious slaves, fueled by decades of mistreatment and the death of Tomas, showed no mercy. Don Eduardo, Dr. Herrera, the 2 remaining soldiers, and 4 other white overseers were brutally murdered. Isabella, locked in her room, listened to the screams and chaos, knowing her world was crumbling forever. Maria remained with her, both women embracing as violence swept through the house beneath their feet. When the sun rose over Havana, the rebellion was over. The slaves who had participated in the massacre had fled into the mountains. Knowing that the Spanish troops would soon arrive, Isabella Mendoza, widowed at 17 before she could have been married, found herself alone in a house full of corpses, pregnant with a dead man's child. She would inherit a plantation ruined by bloodshed and revenge. The story of Isabella Mendoza and Tomas became legendary in Cuba. Some said Isabella died of sadness a few weeks after the massacre. Others claimed she had given birth to her mixed-race son and fled to Spain, where she lived out the rest of her life in a convent. The truth is that the San Rafael hacienda never recovered. The Spanish authorities captured and executed most of the rebellious slaves, but the story of their forbidden love and bloody revenge spread across the island like a fire that could not be extinguished. Because in the end, this isn't just the story of two doomed lovers. It's the story of a system that turned love into a capital crime, that transformed human beings into property, that sowed hatred where compassion should have flourished. The echo of those screams on the night of October 15, 1699 resonated for centuries in the sugar-cane fields of Cuba, reminding each generation that injustice always finds a way to exact its toll, and that sometimes true love can destroy entire worlds. This was a true story from colonial Cuba, where love turned into tragedy and revenge into justice. If you were moved by this story, subscribe for more historical tales that will make you reflect on human nature. And don't forget to comment. Do you think Isabella and Tomas would have had a different fate in another era? See you in the next video.